Okay, you see me now?
There you are, man. Welcome.
Do I need to change the lighting or anything? I guess I could move my clothes rack out of the way, right?
You look good, man. Is that your office that you're broadcasting from right now?
It's my like kitchen area. The light's by going out, but
Okay. Well, I know that you do noon to 3 every weekday, and talking for 3 hours is not an easy task. How do you like to disconnect after a day at work?
that's a great question. A lot of times I go to the gym, to be honest with you. When I did Jimmy until 7 o'clock, I used to do for years, I did 3 to 7 p.m. And that was kind of like the gym times. My rhythm's usually like right around 6 or 7 o'clock.
Right.
So I would go to the gym then a lot of times. I think now I usually come home. I watch like back-to-back episodes of Seinfeld. I think it's on Comedy Central or one of those channels. So I just kind of kick back and relax a little bit, to be honest with you. Watch TV, check my mail. Seemingly, Jimmy, as you know, there's always something different, right? That pops up each day. There's something different I got to do or different place I got to be. And then
Uh,
I go to the gym and I try to get some treadmill time or whatever it might be for an hour or so, like around dinner time. So you know, it is interesting. I think so many people to make it relatable to people that don't do radio. If you're on a road trip or you're driving by yourself somewhere, and I think everybody's done this, and you get to your destination and you think to yourself, what have I been thinking about for the last 3 hours? I was in the car by myself. Like, what was I thinking about that whole time? How did I pass the time? And I think the same thing happens when you do radio. But a lot of times you get done, at least I do. And I'm like, man, what did I talk about for the last 3 hours? And I forget a lot of it because you're kind of in a zone. And so a lot of times I end up, frankly, kind of forgetting what we talked about, what I did. And then people remind me, and so we go on. But it's a fun job. It's not a hard job. I'm very fortunate to have it. I know I'm fortunate to have it. It can be taken at any time. I know that too. So I enjoy it while I do it.
um, how much preparation goes into your job? I mean, that filling 3 hours of time is again not easy, especially when you don't have some material to rely on.
For me, I've always been lucky to work with guys that do a lot of preparation. Quite frankly, I mean, Derek Schultz did a ton of prep work. I've been definitely when I did the morning show with Mark Dykton and Kevin Bowen, they did a lot of Mark did a lot of prep work. I've always been pretty free flowing. I have a general idea. I mean, I know the day before I get a list of who we're going to talk to, and then I look to make sure that I'm up to speed on what the different teams are doing. And then a lot of times just on my drive in, I kind of think about like, okay, what's the topic today? What areas? How do I want to broach it? Um, and I've just always kind of been one of those guys. I think it goes back to when I was a younger guy, and I'm talking when I was like in middle or high school. Ed
Mhm.
Sorensen was kind of my mentor, the longtime sports director of WRTV Channel 6. And he took me under his wing at a young age. And I remember one time we were at dinner or something, and I said to him, I'm like, man, I don't know how you like go on camera and you're on your microphone and you don't have like notes or cue cards. And he said, Jake, I mean, how long have we been sitting here talking? I said, I don't know, 20 minutes or whatever it was. And he said, well, how many times have you had to look at a cue card? And I've never forgotten that. So I usually will just jot down 4 or 5 things of that want to make sure that we talk about. And then I just go and I let the energy take me from one subject to the next and the inertia of it and just the momentum of it and have fun with it. And I think the most important thing is just to have fun with it.
Well, something that got me started early in the business is my dad's involvement with the Bob and Tom show. And I'm just curious, since you grew up in Indianapolis, how much did you listen to Bob and Tom when they kind of got first started?
Well, I mean, I think everybody did. When I was in high school, it's funny, Jimmy, because Bob and Tom came to Indianapolis like 82 or 83, right in there.
Mhm.
And, I was a young kid and my dad was a pretty like straight laced kind of guy. So I think my dad, the humor of Bob and Tom, I think my dad understood the humor of it for certain. Um, but my dad was more one of those like you should be listening to Kitty Pop or whatever. So when I got to the age of high school and was driving to school with my buddies every morning, I mean I'm not kidding, and I remember this like it was yesterday. The I went to North Central High School. I grew up on the northeast side of Indianapolis, and we would take the same route every day, and we would come up Keystone and then take the ramp to 86th Street and go 82nd Street actually as it became 86th into North Central. So we're sitting at the exit ramp, and I'm with Chris Farkas, my buddies in the car, and like by Scott McConnell or Mike. So we're sitting in the car
Hmm.
and we're listening to Bob and Tom, and they're doing a bit, probably one of the songs that your dad, who was one of the legendary musicians locally, in Indianapolis music history, was probably a part of it, or any of the different cast of characters. They had a ton of them, right? I mean, whether
Yeah.
it be Steve Ali, there were a million of them. So they were doing whatever bit, and we start laughing. And I remember looking around, and you're looking at other cars at the stoplight, and every person in their car is laughing. Literally, every person's laughing, and it was like, man, it was it was Indianapolis. I mean, that was like, to live in Indianapolis, to grow up in Indianapolis, was to listen to the Bob and Tom show. I mean, quite frankly. And then not only that, Jimmy, but I think for so many people, for my buddies in particular, to bring it to a sports circle, when the Pacers first made their playoff runs and the Pacers first broke through, in the NBA Pacers, I mean, and the Reggie versus the Knicks, and beating the Orlando Magic and beating the Atlanta Hawks, and getting so much of all of that, the energy of it, the enthusiasm for it, the excitement, was epicentered around. You couldn't wait to listen to the Bob and Tom show the next morning to hear what Chick McGee was saying about it, Mark Patrick, and to hear, whether it be obviously Christie there, but then Pat Carlini or Gunner was going out to the airport and interviewing people as the Pacers came back from beating the Knicks. It was such, literally, Bob and Tom was, I think, for so many people in this town, that was the place where you convened to talk about what was going on in the city of Indianapolis. And for me, it was a thrill not only to be a part of that when I worked at their sister station at WNDE, but then also to do morning sports at the Fan and be able to continue that tradition of talking sports. Because back then you didn't have a morning sports show, right? Now you have a morning sports show, and Tom Griswold and Bob Gavoya both have obviously been very good to me. And I still respect greatly their place in terms of the local market. And to be able to go up against them was a real thrill. And I certainly, they're Hall of Famers for a reason. And they are absolutely a part of the Americana of Indianapolis, the Indiana of Indiana, if you will.
Did you meet them before working with them, and what would you say were the things that you learned from them that stick with you?
Did I meet them? I mean, it would be disingenuous to say I really met them. Like I was in
Yeah.
acquaintance, I guess you'd say. I
Okay.
certainly knew of them. I had a friend, probably in our early college years, a buddy of mine worked at a golf course that Bob Cavoyan would go into. I had friends that went to Hillcrest Country Club where Tom Griswold was there. So I would see them and introduce myself, but they wouldn't know who I was, right?
Right.
I
Yeah.
remember when I was a much younger kid going, because we were at Hillcrest, and walking across the street and going to Q95 just to see if we could get bumper stickers from Bob and Tom. I mean, that was such a thrill to have a Bob and Tom sticker on my window. But no, when I really met them was when I was hired in 2011, I guess it would have been, at WNDE. And just before that, I'll tell you a funny story. I was in my gym, and I had been working actually at WIBC, and that's where I became a member of the IndyCar Radio Network, the IMS Radio Network. And I worked for WIBC. Eventually, they had layoffs, and I was laid off in like '08. And I worked for probably a year and a half, maybe even 2 years, doing just racing stuff. I
Mm.
didn't have a full-time job per se. I was just a freelancer that was doing the racing stuff. So I was doing that, and I was in my gym one day. Tom Griswold was a member of my gym, and I knew who he was, obviously. And I was on a treadmill, and he walked up and said, "Is your name Jake Query?" And I said, "It is." And he said, "Well, I'm Tom Griswold." And I said, "I'm well aware." And he said, "Listen, I got to be honest with you. I think the Indianapolis 500 radio broadcast is the best live sports broadcast ever done on radio." And I said, "Well, man, I appreciate that." And he said, how do you guys do that, like, so seamlessly, the orchestra of it? Because at that time, I had just moved to turn two. I was at turn two of the Open. So we chatted for a second, and he said, "Well, hey, look, we should do lunch sometime." So we did. And I just stayed in touch with them. And that facilitated an open for, once their sister station WNDE had an opening. Obviously Tom is pretty well respected within that building. So he helped facilitate a connection for me to get an interview within that capacity. But and then once I got in there, Derek Schultz and myself, appear to do Colts stuff with them during the course of the football season. And that's where I got to know both of them. And the thing that I think that I learned from it was just twofold, I think. In Bob's case, I learned that being everybody's friend is advantageous because then you have A, no enemies, but B, you're relatable. And when you're relatable and when you connect with people, you have an audience and you have an appreciation not only for the fact that you're able to talk to them each morning or each afternoon, but in addition to that, you're able to connect with them and you feel like you have this wide group of friends and supporters. And it's an incredibly, warm feeling, I guess. And like when I went through health complications, it was great because I felt like I had a city behind me. And that was because I learned from Bob about connecting. I didn't connect in any way, shape, or form, even an infantile percentage of the amount that he has in this market. But Bob, I think, showed me without even realizing it what it was like to just be a decent human and to just be somebody that found humor, was creative, but did so in a way that lifted people and didn't tear people. And that was such a huge thing for me to be able to see, that making people feel involved as opposed to making people feel inferior was invaluable. As for Tom was incredibly loyal to both Derek and myself. He was helpful. I noticed that when I was in there, and I don't know how many people realize this, but when I worked in that building, the number of people that I saw that came through that building that had formerly worked there, that circumstances or parent companies or economics made it impossible for them to have a full-time position. And Tom Griswold found ways to keep those people involved, to keep them around, to keep them a part of the team, and was a truly business-minded and still is business-minded person in that regard, but also just, again, had an incredible loyalty for people and never in any way, shape, or form created a caste system amongst those that had helped him. I mean, if you were somebody that had helped Tom along the way, it didn't matter to him whether you were somebody that was helping by sweeping the floor or helping by being on the air with him for 3 hours a day. He treated everybody the same and has always been an open door policy guy, not just for myself, but for so many people within the industry. So I think the loyalty and the respect of competitor and, contemporary was something that I learned from Tom. And that goes without saying that none of that touches on the incredible talent both of them had in terms of their on-air chemistry and their on-air production.
One more follow up to Bob and Tom. Do you have a favorite bit that makes you laugh?
Obviously, when I was doing the morning show, I didn't get to hear a lot of them, right?
Yeah.
But there's a million of them. Probably the funniest thing I ever heard on that show was, and it wasn't a regular bit, it was a spontaneous bit, which was the brilliance of it. But during a brief time when Chick had gone to San Diego and Gunnar was filling in the morning, and that was during one of the Pacer runs, the Pacers had knocked out, I think it was the Knicks. It might have been when they knocked out Atlanta, but I think it was, no, because they beat Atlanta here. So it would have been when they beat the Knicks. And in the 95 Eastern Conference semifinals, they finally beat New York, slayed the Dragon. They sent Gunnar to interview fans. And he was interviewing fans, and Tom Griswold said, "All right, the next one we have here, it just says Monica." And Dave Gunnar said, yeah, this is a girl that was very excited. She was very pumped up. And so I asked her a question. And what ensued was, by all accounts, I believe, completely spontaneous. But the sound clip from Monica was one of the 5 most inappropriate things ever said on Indianapolis radio. I don't think that Tom Griswold was forewarned of what was said. Gunnar was just trying to earn his stripes because Chick was in San Diego. And the incredulous, spontaneous, but completely organic nature in which the room erupted in laughter and to some extent at the expense of Tom's uncomfortable nature of it. To this day, when I hear it, I think it's the greatest thing ever. I laugh about it. They had great bits. I mean, obviously Sid Gurney was fabulous, right? Obviously, the King, Dave the King Wilson's characters were fantastic. Mark Patrick had a ton of great characters. The songs they created, I mean, everything from Dear Penthouse to it goes on and on and on. Just the overall creativity. And I think the thing that made them so unique and a huge credit to them, Jimmy, is the fact that for so long, the thing that made Bob and Tom so brilliant was the creativity with which they were able to push the envelope of what would be allowed on, regular over the air, regular, AM, FM radio, obviously. And then once satellite and internet radio came about, that line was gone. So there was no line for them to push
Hmm.
necessarily, but there still was. And there still is a fun in that being pushed because you know what the limits are of where they currently are on actual terrestrial radio. But their ability to not only push that envelope, but then adapt once that line was erased and still create brilliant content, to me, that's why they're in the Hall of Fame. They're Hall of Fame dudes, but they're Hall of Fame broadcasters for sure.
Well, one bit that I know Dad was proud of to create, he was part of something called Coach Potato with Mark Patrick.
Yeah. Well,
And
Patrick is legendary, man.
yeah, well, and with the passing of Bob Knight too, it's just cool that Dad is kind of cemented with him with that bit too. And being a sports guy, I wanted to ask you, Bob Knight certainly a character that a lot of people feel differently about depending on who you ask, but a legendary figure that isn't here anymore. That's moved on.
Yeah, and Jimmy, here's the thing about Knight. What is fascinating, and I don't know that we'll see this again. Bob Knight was at his apex in the state of Indiana, not only the most powerful figure in the state of Indiana, I think one could argue that he was the most powerful sports figure to any state in the United States within their state. I mean, you could make the argument for Joe Paterno in Pennsylvania. You could make the argument for Bear Bryant in Alabama. But in terms of the ubiquitous power that they wielded and simply always being the center of a conversation, if you had been from 1983 till probably 1997, that 14-year period, and we're not even talking about 72 to 83. I mean, 83 is probably late, so let's go to 1979 probably, because Knight gets hired in 71, first season 72, goes to the Final Four in 73, undefeated in 76, undefeated regular season in 75, national champ in 76, 79 Pan Am gold medal, strikes the cop in Puerto Rico in 79. 81 national championship, 80 Big Ten champs, 83 Big Ten champs. So during that time, all of it, his power was incredible and his popularity, but his polarization. At no point during that time could you have stopped anybody in the state of Indiana and simply asked them the question. My cat's about to jump right in front of the screen here, so welcome to Boo. At no point, though, during that time, Jimmy, could you have stopped anybody in Indiana and said, what do you think of Bob Knight? And gotten anything less than a 15 to 20-minute conversation. Everyone had an opinion. Everybody had a deep dissertation. Everybody had a passionate opinion. No one would have just said, I'm not a big fan. People either were going to run through a wall for him or they were going to throw you down a flight of stairs about him. And it was amazing. That, of course, doesn't even touch on the fact that he was clearly one of the greatest, if not the greatest coaches in the history of college basketball. But he was a dynamic figure. He was a larger-than-life personality. He was a brilliant basketball coach with an incredible influence, not just on the game of basketball, but the culture within the state of Indiana. And in addition to that, or on top of all of that, he was somebody that had his eccentricities. He had his generosities. He had his incredibly negative side of controversies and not being able to reel in things when it was most needed. Some of the things that he most demanded from others, like personal discipline and accountability, were two things that ultimately eluded him and cost him his job. So he was the ultimate paradox. Bob Knight was the largest paradox in the state of Indiana. And as you can tell by my answer, there is just no short answer about him other than to say he was a massive part of who we were. Whether you didn't like him or you did like him, if you were vacationing in Fairbanks, Alaska, if you were vacationing in Buenos Aires, Argentina, Paris, France, or Leningrad, Russia, no matter where you went, if you said you were from Indiana during that 15 to 20-year period, immediately the first answer back to you would be, don't throw a chair at me, or what do you think of Bob Knight? It was an incredible, incredible link to this state.
One benefit of being part of the media is free food at stadiums. Have you had food outside of Lucas Oil Stadium, or is that the only one that you've tried?
Oh man, you mean like in covering games?
Yeah, like what's the best spread that you've seen?
Okay, so this is easy. I've covered games at every NFL stadium. I've covered games in probably 12 to 14 Major League Baseball stadiums. I've covered them in probably 8 different NBA arenas.
Mm.
The number one spread I've ever seen. First off, let me take that back. When I was in St. Louis and I covered the St. Louis Rams, they had a free ice cream machine in the press box, and I had no off switch with the drumsticks. It was unbelievable. I mean, I would eat like I just couldn't stop. Um, Milwaukee, believe it or not, in the old Milwaukee Bradley Center, when the Milwaukee Bucks were playing the Pacers in the 2000 playoffs opening round, they would like basically lease it out to different restaurants. And I mean, it was like steakhouses and some of the best restaurants in Milwaukee. It was incredible. Milwaukee was the best. That one really jumps out at me. I remember New Orleans. I was down there at the end of the year in the 2000 NFL season because I went from Indy right at the time the Pacers made the finals. I moved to St. Louis. I was going back and forth actually, but I was in St. Louis. I was covering them, and they had a year-ender against the New Orleans Saints where the Saints beat the Rams, but the Rams still got into the playoffs and opened in the playoffs against the Saints. So we stayed in New Orleans the whole time, and we're at the Saints practices and everything else. And they fed us really good, like etouffee and Cajun food, which was great for 2 days. By 3 days, you're kind of over it. By 4 days, you were bloated. And by 5 days, you're like, okay, enough, anything else. But I mean, it was good. It was just a little excessive after an entire week. San Francisco back in the day, I think they might have had clam chowder at one time when I was covering the Niners at Candlestick. That was cool. By far the worst. And maybe one of my claim to fames. My only claim to fame, really. I forget the year, but Bill Polian was right behind me. The Colts were playing the Bengals. Might have been a preseason game, but the Colts were playing the Bengals in Cincinnati at Paul Brown Stadium, and all they served were hot dogs and Diet Cokes. That was it, and regular Cokes. And I was waiting in line, and I got the last hot dog in front of Bill Polian. And Bill Polian was livid because he couldn't get a hot dog, but the guy's like, sorry, man, like 2 minutes left in the half, we're done. And like after my hot dog, he shut the thing, and Bill Polian sat there and watched me eat a hot dog, and he was starving. That's kind of cool. But man, I can still taste that food in Milwaukee. It was darn good.
You didn't have the urge to give Bill your hot dog since he's like the executive, the one in charge, you know?
No, man, I figured he made more money than me. He's probably covered in that regard. And
that's right.
During the playoffs, he put portalets in the parking lots so that we in the media had to go out and use those so that we weren't seen walking through the building to potentially steal stuff from the Colts. So I didn't feel too bad about eating a hot dog. I like both, and he wouldn't know me probably from Adam, but I have since interviewed him about some of the tough things about covering his franchises. And I've always respected the fact that he had been, I mean, he was like, yeah, I was probably a little harder than I needed to be. And I got a great respect for him. He's obviously a football savant, was great at what he did, brought a lot of joy to people in this town. But he had his moments. And that was one of those moments where for a split second, Jimmy, it's not.
Well, and with having cerebral palsy and being 5'4" and the structure that I am, the possibility of being a professional athlete went bye-bye to me a long time ago. But did you play high school sports at all?
I played basketball. I played basketball at, and by the way, let me back this up to say this. And I'm not just saying this, and I hope this doesn't upset you or offend you when I say it. There is obviously no stigma nor a weakness that comes with having cerebral palsy. By no means in any way, shape, or form is it something that labels you or that you have with a sign over your head or that makes you look different than other people. But I don't know, other than seeing that maybe just from a fluidity standpoint of your step movement and the way that you walked, I don't know that I ever knew that about you. You know, I have never in any way, shape, or form seen that as a label with you. To me, you're Jimmy Kennedy that, you know, worked for the Colts and has been a producer in radio, and your dad's a musical legend, and you're friends with the Cavoyans, and you know that's how I see you, right? So I'm aware of the fact that for you, and I don't undermine or undersell the fact that that has to be a label, Jimmy, if you will, that you have always felt attached to you. But while I'm aware and respectful of the fact that I can't pretend to know what that's like to have that label, I
Uh,
think it's also important for you to understand that that doesn't mean always that that label is attached to you from outside sources, number one. But I get what you're
I
saying.
appreciate that. No.
I played basketball at North Central. I knew, matter of fact, I'll tell you what, I played basketball at North Central my freshman year. I was tall. Um, I was a really good like pickup player, but I wasn't very good in organized basketball. And I think part of that was number one, by the time you're in high school, you're playing against guys that are stronger, faster, bigger, right? Um, and it was interesting because I'd always been a big player my whole life. I'm 6'4", so I was always the tallest kid. Then I get to high school freshman year, and I was taller, but I had to start, changing from an inside player to kind of an outside player, which I was fine with because I never was afraid to shoot the ball. But I had epilepsy as a kid, and because I had epilepsy as a kid, I was on a medication called Dilantin, which kind of made concepts difficult for me to grasp, notably algebra and things like that. And I couldn't learn our offense. And I didn't tell anybody I didn't know the offense, but I never knew what I was supposed to do. So when I would get on the floor, I was kind of a nervous Nancy because I didn't know where the ball was supposed to go. I didn't know where I was supposed to be. So if I got the ball, I was shooting it because as long as I shot it, I didn't have to do whatever the next rotation was in the offense. So my skills were pretty limited anyway, but that probably didn't help my cause. But North Central had a great opportunity for me to do play-by-play for my junior and senior year with Adam Alexander in basketball. I did for football. I did it with Mac Engel, who works for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. And we had great experiences. We had a great time. We had a lot of fun calling games at Hinkle. Adam and I were the first two high school kids ever to be granted credentials to do the Indiana and Kentucky All-Star game on a high school station, which was the biggest thrill in the world to me. So I loved it. And I loved being able to watch the great players that we had at North Central, whether it be the guys older than me, like Tony Barbie and Aaron Shelby and Bill Gillis when they were players, or the guys that I got to call their games, like Greg Black and Grady Flatter and Eric Allen that later went on to play football at Indiana. We had great players, Kai Steffi. We had a lot of great players, football and basketball, and to be able to call their games and feel like I was a part of it was super.
Well, and I graduated from Carmel, but North Central holds a special place in my heart because Doug Mitchell, the head coach for a long time there, I won scholarship in the name of his son, Bryce Mitchell. I won
Yeah.
that scholarship as a senior, and Dad played golf with him all the time. So we would go early to the game when I was broadcasting, and we would boo him from press row just to try to draw his attention.
Of course, right?
Yeah, and to give Doug credit, he may not like this, but he's the best cursing head coach you'll ever hear. Like if you want to hear a head coach list off some profanity, Doug Mitchell's number one.
I've always heard, like officials have told me that Doug was tough. My cousin Lucas, actually my cousin Robin's son, so my first cousin once removed. Lucas was one of the guards on the team that Jason Gardner was with that won the state 25 years ago, as a matter of fact. And Doug was the coach. Doug was there after I was a player. I mean, when I was a student, Steve Kaufman was the coach. North Central won the sectional over Arlington, 66-52, mind you, in the 1991 sectional championship. And then Doug really took the program to the next level. Always been good to me, just a tremendous dude, clearly a great coach, and a guy that was a great guidance for a lot of different young men that came to North Central.
Heavy part of the show here. What are the best life lessons you've been able to learn through your career, Jake?
You just always try to be good to people, right? Like just be a decent person. Never take yourself too seriously. Here's the way I look at it. Indianapolis is a great city. It's my hometown. It's a great city. I love it. I love everything about it. And it's fun to do a job in Indianapolis where your voice, where you can talk and people can hear it. But how many people in Indianapolis can board a plane in Indianapolis and then get off that airplane after 2 hours on the airplane? And when they get off that airplane, have anybody know or care anything about what they do? Not very many, right? So it's all relative. And I think that people take themselves too seriously. And if you take yourself too seriously, then I think what you're doing is you're adversely having other people that look at it and can understand or think that you have an inflated opinion of who you are and what you do. It's never about you. It's about what, if you have a platform or a microphone or an opportunity, it's about what you can do to try to help or lift other people. And I didn't always know that. I didn't always learn that. I think I figured it out over time. I think, Jimmy, for me, I don't know that I'm very good at what I do, quite frankly, but I've been able to do it for a long time. And I think one of the reasons I've been able to do it for a long time is because I just made the determination that my best lasting power was going to be by just being me, not playing a character, not playing some, overzealous type A, kind of asshole. Like that doesn't do you any good.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I just decided to be me. And then since then, let me tell you this, and I've mentioned this story before, and I'll give you the condensed version. But I had a heart attack in October of 20. I've talked about it to the point where people are probably tired of hearing me talk about it. But I had a heart attack in October of 20. And when I had it, they came into the room and they're looking at the printout of the wires, what they're telling them about my heart. And Dr. Mottman comes in, the cardiological interventionist, greatest title of anybody I know. And he says, you have a 100% blockage in your widowmaker artery. And so I'm like, okay. So I thought, well, this is pretty serious. I thought, this is not indigestion. So at that point, I knew about the cath lab and angioplasty because my dad had gone through it. So I was a little bit versed in what all goes into that. But at that point, I remember saying to myself, like, okay, so, and I asked him, I said, so I'm going to die, right? And he said, well, no, but the next 15 minutes are very critical, very important. We're going to get you back there and get you feeling better. But I knew that and I was in bad shape. And the nurse was not a very good poker player. Her eyes were this big when she saw the EKG. And in that moment, Jimmy, and I don't know how this came to be, but I think it's part of the reason why I'm able to sit here and talk to you and why I came out of it. I was totally at peace. I was completely comfortable with it. And I had what's called panoramic life review, which is actually a phenomenon. And maybe it's like a shock, right? But like I literally did see the quote unquote life flash before your eyes. I saw it. And everything went quiet. And I was looking at myself in the third person. And then I started I remember I could see myself walking through a field and I came up on my headstone and I looked at my headstone. And I remember I was like, man, 48 years old. Like I can't believe I only lived to be 48. I would have liked more time than that. And then I asked myself, but if this is the time you got, are you okay with it? And I said, you know what? I am. Because when I would be on a trip and there was something I wanted to see and I was that close, I didn't turn around. I'm like, I'm this close. I might as well go see it. I had the people that I loved in my life, I think knew I loved them. I didn't have anybody that I needed to call and make a quick amend with. I didn't have anybody that I truly was at odds with or had ill will towards. I didn't have any scores to settle. And so I was cool with it. And I think that's what got me out. And so as to answer your question long-winded and circuitously, Jimmy, my answer to you is this. I've been in that room. I've been in that room when your mortality is hanging in the balance and you've been informed your mortality is hanging in the balance. And so the way that I live my life now every day is, how are you going to feel in that room? Because you don't have time to make a phone call. You don't have time to go out and bust out an email. And half the phone calls and emails that keep you up at night, you realize are totally irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. Mm-hmm. But in that moment, by my own pure luck and by being surrounded by great people, none of which I had, I've just been lucky. But in that moment, I was at peace because I didn't have anything that I needed to go back to redo. And so that's my answer for you. My answer for you is that I've learned how I'm going to feel in that room. And I've made sure now to make sure that when I go back to that room, that I feel the same way.
Well, let me tell you, Chooch passed away in September of 19 when I was 24 years old. And a lot of people say when one of your parents dies, it changes your world. It really, the world really did change in February of 20, and we've had a tumultuous few years here. But when I look back at my time in broadcasting, time and time again, you've always been a mentor, always been a friend, and made my jobs easier. And I hope I did the same for you, because it's been a joy every time I come across you.
Well, I appreciate that, Jimmy. And I know that, the reality is this: the only difference between myself and what I'm doing for a living and you is years. In terms of the tenacity, in terms of the drive, in terms of certainly the skill set, there's no difference, right? I'm just older. And um, from the time that I was probably 21 or 22 years old, it was really hard for me because when I first got out of school, and I didn't graduate from college until a year ago, but at the time that I naturally assimilated out of the college lifestyle, when my friends were all graduating and going on to different jobs and whatever else, I knew what I wanted to do. And I knew what career I wanted, and I knew what skills I had to possess that. I just had no idea, Jimmy, how to get there. I didn't. It wasn't like it's such an unconventional career path in broadcasting for anybody in broadcasting. It's just such a weird business in general. And there's so few jobs, right? I mean, there's just so few of them that you got to have thick skin and you got to bounce around and you got to be resilient and all of those things. And I don't know that I was. I think I just was hanging around long enough that eventually people realized I wasn't going to go away. I mean, I really think that's what it was. But my point to you being that I have always been impressed by, and you know what, I probably should thank you for this, and that is that I know I'm lucky to do what I do. I know I won't be able to do it forever. And like anybody else with any job in any career in any profession, you have days where you go in and you're like you're dragging, or you don't want to do it, or you're upset about something at work or whatever else. And I have to remind myself and reawaken in me the drive that I had that fueled me when I was a younger person. And part of how I do that is I look at the example you set, because you work hard, you don't complain, you don't lose sight of the goal, you stay forward, you pick yourself up and you keep going. And I realized that if I were to not take advantage of the situations I have, it would be disrespecting the opportunities that you hope for yourself. And so, I'm appreciative of that. And I am very confident in saying that, I don't know when it will be, whether it's a year or a couple of years from now, but you're going to be on, sitting there looking at it going, man, you know what? It did all work out. It did all work out in the end. And I mean, look, you got the Cavoyans in your corner, you got Bob and Tom in your corner, and you got your dad in the corner of the room. So how's it going to go wrong, right? How's it going to go wrong?
Hey, I've had a better career than most people ever get.
For
already,
sure. For sure.
And it's been a joy. I was thinking about real quick, because I know we're already over time. I know that Dad would do the Dry Ryan Bold racing party. One thing I got to do was I got to go into Robbie Buell's car and help wheel it into the truck. Did you ever get to feel being in a race car, what that feels like?
The closest I ever came, it's so funny, Jimmy, like growing up, I was the biggest fan of the Indy 500 and what it meant to this town. And, and I mean, that's another back to Bob and Tom, right? Like it's just a huge part of the Indianapolis culture. And I always thought it'd be so cool to run the Indy 500. And then even though Justin Wilson, the late, great Justin Wilson told me a fabulous anecdote once. Mm-hmm. We were basically the same height. He was 6'4". And I said to him, I go, man, I just always assumed I couldn't be a race car driver because I'm so tall. And he said, you know what, Jake, it's actually to your advantage, because on a road and street course, you never overcorrect because your knees are so high up in the car, the way that you're sitting in them, that you can't turn your hands more than this far or this far. And so your line is always super tight when you're this tall in a race car. And I wish I'd known that when I was like 12. I would have stayed with it, although I never really tried it. But the closest I got is I have been fortunate with the IndyCar Series to be able to do the two-seater ride. And in the two-seater ride, I've taken laps around the Speedway with a couple different drivers. I've taken laps around Pocono with drivers, and then the road course as well, and IRP, places like that. That's the closest I've ever gotten to it. And the one thing I learned was anybody that says drivers aren't athletes is hallucinating because of the physical toll that comes with it, number one. Number two, I was nauseous as hell after like 2 laps. Number three, I couldn't imagine doing it with 32 other cars around me. And number four, when I got out, I felt like I'd been on a roller coaster for like 6 hours. I felt that way after the fact. So those guys and gals that drive those cars are amazing. They're in incredible shape. Their hand-eye coordination is second to none. And the physical toll of the G's on their body is absolutely amazing for them to be able to walk away from it.
Well, coming from a guy who uses hand controls just to get to point A to point B, work or school, going 200 miles an hour in something that small, gosh, goodness. Jake, for folks who want to hear you on the air and reach out, how can they do that?
They can always find me on the air from 12 until 3 every day on 93.5 and 107.5 The Fan. That's the Indianapolis radio station, WFNI The Fan. Again, 93.5, 107.5 The Fan. Also on YouTube, Query and Company is the name of the show. So if you do a YouTube search for Query and Company, and then on X or Twitter or whatever we call it these days, at Jake Query, JakeQuery. And I also do a daily podcast, a weekly podcast, which I truly enjoy on the ISC Sports Network with Derek Schultz. That show is called Query and Schultz. It's available on all the different platforms for audio as well. So I have fun with all of that and certainly look forward to hearing from people.
Cool. What's the next place you're traveling with Shannon? I know you've gone a lot of different places.
Great question, Jimmy. So we just got back from Amsterdam. We were in Amsterdam, Belgium, and Luxembourg. I loved Luxembourg.
Cool.
I don't know what our next trip is going to be. I would really want to go to Slovenia and Switzerland, and she really wants to go to Germany. So we're going to try to figure that out. But here's a little tip for people. If you wait until the last week in October, the weather is not ideal in Europe, but the prices on the airfare is like 50% what it normally would be. So if you can wait until like the week of Halloween, if you're going on Halloween or the day after Halloween to a predominantly Catholic country in Europe, that are basically national holidays, so everything's closed, be mindful of that. But it's fabulous, and I anticipate I'll just say Slovenia and Switzerland, but she's going to override me and say Germany, so we'll see.
Listen to your lady. Go with her.
That's right. Whatever she says, right?
That's right. I hate to end on a political note, but since you have seen other countries, would you ever live outside the United States?
Absolutely, 100%. I would love to live. This is, my parents are here, so theoretically,
sure.
I think Barcelona would be wonderful. Luxembourg was fabulous. I loved Luxembourg. Have you been overseas, Jimmy?
I haven't yet. One person who was on the program, Martha Burst, was a professional basketball player over there, Luxembourg. So
yeah, Luxembourg was wonderful. Luxembourg City was great. It was clean. It was efficient. It was friendly. It was very wealthy, to be honest with you. And people were great. So Luxembourg, I loved. Amsterdam's great. But Barcelona would probably be my number one pick. I loved Paris. Paris was great. Barcelona was wonderful. I just thought the people were great. I thought the beach at the Mediterranean was beautiful. The weather was perfect. I could go for Barcelona.
Cool. Is there anything else you want to add, sir, to the end of this one before we wrap up?
Keep doing you. Keep having fun, and obviously Merry Christmas, right? Merry Christmas, yeah. Happy New Year. I think Hanukkah just finished up or wrapped up, but Happy Hanukkah if that's your choice. Happy Kwanzaa. But it's a great time of year. It's a great holiday season. It's a great time to reflect upon and Jimmy, you say a lot, and I get it. I can't. I'm not in your position yet because my parents are still living. But I know that you said you lost your dad in September of 2019. Is that right?
Yeah. Yep.
But you didn't lose him.
Yeah, he's still around all the time. Yeah.
He's not right there talking to you, but you didn't lose him because he's with you and you do a hell of a job. I hope for everybody in life that they have somebody that champions for them the way you have for your old man. And it's very admirable.
All right, folks, to check out this episode and all others with the podcast, you can make your way over to linktree.com/JBKOnAir. You can also follow me on all social media platforms at JBKOnAir. And if you feel compelled, you can also donate to the show with the link in the description. Until next time, have a great day and a better tomorrow.